Market Insights. This is our conversation series where we discuss important topics related to the small business M&A industry. Please subscribe to our show through YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. A little about me, I am the co-founder and CEO of Private Market Labs, and we are a new platform designed to democratize the small business acquisition process. Today, we just released new medians ratios for each deal on the platform, which means you get matched with a deal and you can see how it stacks up versus the median price to revenue, price to EBITDA for that industry. It's really cool. Check it out on privatemarketlabs.com. We have a fantastic guest today, Kevin Henderson, founding partner at SMB Law Group. SMB Law specializes in the legal side of small business transactions and is also one of the most influential organizations in our space, just from a thought leadership and legal knowledge perspective. So welcome to the pod, Kevin. Really, really happy to have you.
Thanks, Josh. Super excited to be here and chat about the small business space. We're obviously passionate about it, as you are. So yeah, excited to see where this goes.
Fantastic. So through your work at SMB Law, you see a lot of deals. Are there any common characteristics of deals that tend to close versus ones that don't?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's hard to say by deal of the common characteristics. There's usually things about the deal process that can be more of those red flags and things like that. So, a lot of times when deals fall apart, when you're kind of reviewing things post hoc, right? Your Monday morning quarterbacking and kind of figuring out what went wrong, you're oftentimes able to see things like, difficulty getting information in the early stages out of sellers, right? You see things like very difficult broker processes or gatekeeping and things like that. And when you aren't playing the game exactly like they want to, or you're wanting more information than they're comfortable giving, those are kind of two things that we often see leading to deals falling apart. Generally, information's not forthcoming because it's information they don't want to share. There's usually a reason, right?
It's bad news. No one with good news.
Yeah, they want an LOI with a deposit that's non-refundable and things like that before they're sending you tax returns. And it's like, okay, I get the sensitivity of tax information, but there's got to be some reasonable give and take. And the ones where you get to closing and it's like, man, that was just the smoothest transaction ever. You look back on it and it's, counterparties were working together comfortably, sharing information, very open, not hiding the ball. So I think that's one of the biggest things to look at when you're going into the early stages of a transaction. What's the demeanor? What's the quality of information you're being given? How much gatekeeping is happening and roadblocks are being put up to get to the next step and see the next thing. So that's a big one. Another one I would say, organization. We harp about this all the time. We should trademark it at this point, but it's probably out there too much. But I mean, time kills deals. We say this over and over again. It's like a broken record, right? And the more disorganized the process is, the harder it is to get to the closing table. And for those that are listening that are searchers or buyers or looking at businesses, just understand this isn't squarely on you either. I mean, it's really a team effort. And when I look back at deals once again that were super pleasant, that doesn't mean there's hard fought battles, there's tough negotiations, but things where it gets resolved, things are smooth. There's very often parties on both sides, legal counsel, broker, etc., all working together hand in hand as a deal team to try and get that deal across the finish line. And so keeping on top of organization, making sure people are doing what they're supposed to do, keeping on top of deadlines, maintaining your word and things like that. When we see relationships start to sour, a lot of times that can be traced back to, obligations aren't being fulfilled, things aren't being done when they're supposed to, and it just starts to ruin that goodwill. And understandably, people's spider sense goes up, right? It's not necessarily anything big, but when you're routinely, not fulfilling your obligations, it spooks people. And that goes the other way around. It should spook you just as much as it may spook your seller if you're looking to buy a business. So, I mean, those are a couple of things that come to mind that, I see as kind of a common thread. There's obviously always the
Sure.
common ones of, you get post LOI and the financials just don't match up to the sim, the,
Yeah.
seller add backs. And that's what diligence is for.
Sure.
That stuff happens. People get aggressive. But if you take that step back to really think through what are some of the characteristics across deals, that you can control, you can't control misstated financials, right?
Right.
Those are things that come to mind.
Yeah, you talk about control, and I think, maybe I'm projecting a little bit, but I would assume that a lot of the people who have the gumption to go out and buy a small business and really engage with this process are also, very action-oriented people, have a
Yeah.
strong like internal locus of control in the sense of like I internalize all the good and bad things that happen to me as, part of my own. I have the capacity to control all these things. Like, are there things that like buyers can do or that the most successful buyers are doing that more people should know about? Stuff that maybe isn't as obvious, or maybe really the obvious stuff is the most important stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think running a high quality deal process, is a big one, and I'll unpack for a second what I mean by that. A lot of our clients or a lot of people out there, and that's not saying you have to be this to be successful by any means, but a lot of folks have grown up in kind of the private equity world or things like that, and then they're moving to small business. They bring with them a level of private equity sophistication, which can be a downside, and we can always talk about that in a second.
Sure.
So you don't want to look like private equity to the general small business seller, but it's really nice to run your transaction like a private equity buyer. And what do I mean by that? Um, when I'm talking about people in good control and really having, kind of a hands-on approach to their deal process, you're talking transaction timelines from the beginning, right? Being open with your seller of like what to expect and when to expect it. Very common in the private equity world, very rare in the small business world, right? Transaction checklists. You can lean on advisors for things like that. Like your legal counsel can work with you on developing early on in the process, not just a timeline, but a good transaction checklist. A lot of sellers who've never sold a business go into this process thinking, you know, they're going to do a little due diligence, peeking under the hood. We're going to sign a document and like, $4 million are going to show up in my bank account.
Right.
They don't understand, and if they don't have a good broker or seller legal counsel engaged at that point in the sales process, they may not fully understand like what actually goes into getting a deal closed, the amount of documents to be worked through, negotiated, reviewed, and things like that. And if you pile that on, once again, I come back to, you can really spook a seller and put their guard up when you're open up front with like, hey, this is a really long checklist, but we're going to go through this methodically, spread out over 8 weeks. It becomes a lot more manageable. So yeah, I think running a high quality deal process is really important. Um,
Gotcha.
the second thing I would say that I see, the most successful searchers, they're really great people, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Um, uh, you know, the what we often tell our clients, and this is common in the legal world, like let us be the bad guy, not because we are bad guys as legal counsel. Oftentimes when it's funny, I actually talk clients back from the ledge a lot when they're like getting frustrated with sellers legal counsel, and I have to remind them like, hey, just so you know, like they're probably not a horrible person, right? They're
Right.
advocating for their client, and their client may be asking them like, hey, can you kind of hold the hammer here? And it's a really smart strategy, because at the end of the day, even if you're buying 100% of a business, to an extent, you're still kind of a partner with that seller after
Yeah.
closing. There may be some post-closing transition period. There may be a seller note where they're effectively your creditor at that point. It's super, super important to preserve the goodwill in that relationship and do everything you can to focus on having a good relationship with your seller, having a good relationship with employees to the extent you're talking to them during the deal process and things like that. So if there's really something where you need to kind of tighten the screws, don't be afraid to rely on advisors, because I see
Yeah.
people that are very successful searchers and buyers. They are really, really great at building that rapport and maintaining it at all costs throughout the deal process. Even when there's things where they're like, no, I'm really putting my foot down on this, but I need you as legal counsel to be the one to put the foot down so that I can still, kind of have that one step removed and maintain that really friendly, really friendly relationship. So that's another one that immediately springs to mind.
Sort of like managing your interpersonal capital, so to
Yeah.
speak, right? You come in, you've
Yeah.
got a relationship that you're just starting to establish. It's like, how do you figure out where to outsource that conflict to somebody else?
100%. And, and sometimes it can't be avoidable. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that this is like the only way to do deals. My only point is the most successful buyers and searchers are the ones that really develop a keen sense of developing that relationship with the seller and trying to maintain that as friendly as possible to the finish line. Um, it's not often the relationship that leads there, but every deal that falls apart, there's always a soured relationship. Whether it precipitated the deal falling apart or was a result of the deal falling apart is another discussion. But it certainly can precipitate a deal falling apart when the seller starts to lose that faith, see you as very aggressive, trying to take advantage and things like that. So there are things you can do to focus on kind of the interpersonal people skills with the seller to try and maintain as positive a relationship as possible.
So let's say you've been called in to be the hammer in a certain situation, right? What are some of the biggest legal pitfalls that
Yeah.
you're usually addressing when you're coming in? Like, what do you have your eyes really peeled for?
Yeah. I mean, there's a number of things. Legal diligence is one bucket. I'll talk about that for a quick second. And
Yeah.
we're really wanting to come in and help review the legal makeup of the company and do legal diligence. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it though, only because it's not to say legal diligence isn't important. But what I usually counsel clients is the types of matters that come up in legal diligence are generally just contract matters. They usually don't kill deals, right? The things that kill deals are business and financial matters. If if EBITDA is $250,000 less than it was purported to be in a sim,
Right.
you can't contract around $1 million on a 4x multiple,
Right.
difference in valuation. In the same way that you can contract around, hey, we identified this potential litigation issue out there. That doesn't need to kill the deal. We can go do things in the purchase agreement to try and insulate that liability and protect against the liability. So diligence is really important, but it's usually not a deal killer type of thing. So moving from that, what do we look at next? There are a few pieces that happy to be open about to the help of my seller representative counterparties here that are super important to a buyer that we're focused on. And number one is the indemnification. And part of the problem with the small business space is that a lot of the representation in the space isn't super sophisticated as M&A lawyers.
Yeah.
And they don't fully understand the implications. Sometimes they don't fully understand even what they're asking for. And I'll give you a really simple example of something that we see routinely that should be a huge problem. It's not necessarily a red flag because oftentimes it arises out of ignorance and not understanding how these provisions work. And that is that, people know that oftentimes damages in a contract will have some sort of cap, and they'll go do some research and they'll Google, and PitchBook has some study that says, a normal cap is, 10 to 15% of the purchase
Right.
price, without understanding the nuance that cap only applies to very discrete, specific types of damages, not the entire agreement. And so we'll get an indemnification provision that says, hey, this is a $5 million deal, but damages under indemnity are going to be capped at $500,000, full stop, right? No other recourse
Right.
beyond $500,000. Well, stop and think about that for a second. You just agreed to a 5-year non-compete, right? So you close on the sale of your business on March 1st. And on March 2nd, your seller goes across the street, violates your non-compete by hanging out a new shingle, takes your entire customer list, and drums up $2 million of business in 6 months. And so naturally you want to go after them, and they point to this provision and say, sorry, your damages are capped at $500,000. Here's a check
Right.
for $500,000 back, and best wishes, right? Just to take a step back, it's a nonsensical provision.
Right.
But we see stuff like this all the time, right? Trying to squeak through the cracks. And so for us, like, the principal place, the number one place that we focus as buy-side counsel for those who are searching and buying businesses is making sure we can get the protections as extensive and as rock solid as we can from an indemnification perspective. That's a hugely important piece for buyers to kind of understand and focus on.
Do
Um,
you recommend like a reps and warranties insurance or like a deal insurance kind of a thing in this particular case? Or I think I've seen that maybe for larger deals that
yeah,
tends to be effective, and for smaller deals, it might not be worth the cost. Like, what's your opinion on that?
yeah, it's an interesting question because we're at an interesting period in the market. Historically, reps and warranty insurance has been cost prohibitive. It's a fairly new product in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it's been around several, many years now, but in the grand scheme of buying and selling a business, which has been around for centuries, it's a fairly new product. Um, but it's expensive, right? It's becoming more and more common in the private equity world in these upmarket deals where several $1,000,000 for a policy to cover a multi-billion-dollar deal is not the hugest issue.
Yeah.
There are insurance companies, it's a select few, but there are a handful who are starting to write more cost-effective policies
Hmm.
that may make sense in the small business world. Um, from a pure risk allocation perspective, I think they make a lot of sense. I like recommend warranty insurance policies when folks are able to do them. But in this sector, right, dollars and cents matter. And a lot of times, there's a risk analysis being made of what do I think the likelihood of a claim is. And there's this false sense of assurance of like it's a pretty low likelihood of having an actual indemnification claim. Um, and therefore, even if the policy premium's somewhat reasonable, 50, 7500, $1,000 or something on a multi-million-dollar deal, there's this kind of aversion to wanting to pay that premium without knowing that there's actual damages out there. I think it's an interesting conversation that needs to be had more with the community.
Hmm.
One of the issues that we hear increasingly and have been talking more and more about is the difficulties of enforcement of some of these
Hmm.
contractual mechanisms in the small business space. Because, for example, you negotiate a rock solid non compete that a seller goes and just blatantly violates, that's like
Right.
clear cut. It could be the
Right.
most clear cut case in the world, but it's still going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars to engage high quality legal counsel, to issue cease and and desist letters, and then go file a lawsuit and actually hash this out in court. And a lot of times that financial analysis is, man, this could cost me $100,000 to enforce. Is this a make or break the company where it makes sense to spend $100,000, or am I better served sinking $100,000 into just getting out there in the market and just
Right.
beating this horrible seller who's violating the non-compete just kind of out in the market? And so the reason I go down this, kind of rabbit hole is I think it's an interesting conversation to have more, because I think if people start to think more and more about the cost of enforcing some of these contractual provisions, the cost of litigation over disputing whether damages are indemnifiable or not, the ability to have an insurance policy in place already to fall back on and not have to enter into that calculus after you've closed the transaction. Cash flow may be tight and you're having to debate, do I want to spend this money to have this fight right now? You've already built that money and spent it into your transaction costs, and you've got an insurance policy where you can turn it over to a carrier and say, hey, can you either pay out the claim or go fight with the seller if you think you could recover from the seller. So I do think, particularly in the small business space, as some of these policies become more well known, and the costs can kind of come into line with what's supportable with the size of transactions, I do think it's a really interesting product that we'll start seeing people talking more about and selecting to do more and more often, because right now it's still just really rare. There's just too many buyers and sellers looking at it saying like, hey, this business is so clean, there's not going to be a claim. Do we really want to spend $75,000 on an insurance policy? And insurance it's a tough thing, because you
Yeah.
hope that it's one of the weird things that you pay a lot of money for that you hope is wasted money, right? You hope to
Right.
never actually have to use your insurance policy. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a really interesting question, Josh, that I think people will be exploring more and more candidly.
Very cool. So shifting gears slightly, there's a lot of discourse in the community, and I've even had conversations about this on the podcast, sort of about lawyers who don't have a background in SMB M&A taking over deals, making them difficult to close. So one question that I've always sort of wondered is like, how different are the transactions in our space from other M&A deals in a way that might make it harder for a different kind of lawyer or someone with a different background to step in and help on?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question, and I always laugh because when we launched the law firm, we kind of expected that the bulk of our representations were going to be super frustrating across from lawyers who don't do M&A as their day job, and so it's, they're not as savvy on some of the puts and takes and kind of what's acceptable and what's not. And we do, like, I would be misstating to say that we don't see that, and don't see that
Sure.
fairly frequently. What's been surprising, though, is almost kind of the opposite. I'm almost to the point where when I have a deal where someone's actually engaged, like a legitimate larger M&A firm on the other side, I almost like that less,
Hmm.
because it's going to become a battle to what's market. And a lot of times, in this sector, we can negotiate fairly favorable terms on the things that matter for our buyers. When it's not kind of market M&A professionals that have like deal point studies memorized in the back of their head and know within the tenth of a percentage what an
Yeah.
appropriate deductible in an indemnity is, right? And so there's a lot of put and take there. I will say the landscape is all over the place. I mean, when I see a personal injury lawyer on the other side of the deal, it's not it's not a slam dunk over whether that's going to be an easy or hard deal.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really easy just because they do a cursory review. They don't really, aren't super well versed in kind of the puts and takes of things. They do kind of a general review for their client and you move to closing really rapidly. Other times you're fighting over things where you want to pull your hair out because it's like, why are we having this conversation? We should not be,
Right.
we should not be talking about this right now. It's insane. Um, and that's where a lot of knowing the market comes in to play, and knowing what's important, where to really push hard, and when to take a step back. Because there are plenty of times where we'll have to get on the phone with our client and be like, hey, this is literally the craziest thing. Like, it's absolutely absurd that this would be in the contract, but let me break down to you what that risk is so that you can assess. Like, it doesn't do our clients any good to get locked in an academic battle in an agreement if it's not an issue that our client particularly cares about. And so there is a little bit of that give and take. And so yeah, I mean, I think if the Kirkland and Ellis of the world, looked at every purchase agreement we've ever done without that context, there will be deals they look at to be like, these guys are crazy. Why would they ever agree to that? Well, it's not because we're crazy and we agreed to something insane. It's because this is the context we have to work in sometimes. And sometimes we just have to work with our clients and talk through with them.
Yeah.
Hey, here's what the risk is. This is not normal. You would normally never see this, but for whatever reason, seller and their counsel are anchored on this point. If we can mitigate this risk, or it's a risk you're not particularly concerned about, that's a business level decision for our clients to make. And I think where lawyers really do searchers and business buyers and sellers a disservice is when they're not deferring those questions. I mean, a lot of this stuff is risk allocation that at the end of the day is really up to the client to decide. And sometimes the decision is, this is a great business. It's got strong cash flows. This is not a risk I particularly care about. Thank you for explaining what the risk is. And I'm going in eyes wide open, drop the point and let's move on so we can get the deal done.
Yeah.
Which is a perfectly rational and valid, thing to do. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting place. Just in terms of the variability of legal counsel that you don't see if you're traditionally, in upmarket private equity and M&A, where every big firm has rock solid M&A teams. It's kind of all over the place. So yeah, it can be hit and miss whether that's a great thing or a horrible thing for the
Yeah.
deal.
You talk about standard gives and takes
Yeah.
within the space. Could you give us a couple of examples?
Yeah. Yeah. What are some examples? I talk a lot about indemnity just because as predominantly buy side counsel, it's probably the single most important section of a purchase agreement. So, and indemnity is a great example. There are deal point studies out there for, what the right level of damages and deductibles and things like that are. There are cases where I have a very recent deal where they're insistent on a 5% deductible, which if you went to any big law M&A lawyer and said a 5% deductible, like their eyes would pop out of their head. Like that's just so completely outside of market. But it's one of those things where it's like sellers so anchored on that point, we can compromise at 3%, which is still way higher than you would normally ever see for a deductible in an M&A deal. But the client may make a risk assessment of like, hey, look, I'm really comfortable with the level of diligence. If I have to eat a little more on damages on a deductible, like I'm fine doing that to get the deal done. So like there's one example of like a give and take. Other examples, representations and warranties. This is the section of the agreement where the seller's going to make a number of factual statements about the company that form the basis for the buyer to make their decision to purchase the company. And if they turn out to be wrong, they can recover damages to the extent that the buyer has experienced a loss, right? A classic one would be, there's no undisclosed liabilities that aren't on the balance sheet of the company. You get to closing and find out 3 weeks later there's a contract they entered into. There's no accounts payable line item or anything on the company, on the balance sheet. It's like this was $100,000 account payable. Like, well, okay, that was never disclosed.
Right.
It's like there's like a classic breach. And so a lot of times in the reps and warranties, there's going to be some more puts and takes. There's different things you can do with thresholds of whether it's qualified by material, right? It's only wrong if it's materially wrong. What does material mean in this context? And in well-developed M&A circles, I mean, this has been like academically debated ad nauseum, like what should be qualified by materiality, what should be qualified by knowledge. And occasionally you get the estate planning lawyer that just says, I'm adding a knowledge qualifier literally everywhere, right? And so you start
Right.
thinking like this is just so crazy, you would never do this. But there's again that risk assessment of like, okay, if they knowledge qualify this one, do I really care? Maybe not, but if they knowledge qualify that one, I really care. An example would be, do they put a knowledge qualifier in like an environmental rep for a business that does call center answering? Like the likelihood of an environmental liability in a call center is so low, maybe it's not normally knowledge qualified, but like let that one go.
Right.
Conversely, do they knowledge qualify taxes, right? To the seller's knowledge, all of their taxes have been paid. Well, that would be a huge problem because whether the seller knows a tax is due or not, if the tax is not paid, the tax is not paid, and you want to be able to recover that from the seller. So that would be another classic one where, these two things maybe in a normal market deal neither of them would be knowledge qualified. And you may have to decide on some put and take of like, hey, seller, I'm going to meet you in the middle. I can live with this one, but like here are a handful that I just can't live with, and here's why, and make a rational case for what that means. So, it comes up, frequently and routinely during the process of identifying what's most important to you as a business buyer, what carries with it the highest risk to you as a buyer of that specific business, and then balancing, what you're asking for and what you're really pushing for, or where you can give with the seller. And, it gets back to one of my first points of really building that relationship and communicating well. A lot of times you don't have to ask the seller point blank why something's important, but you can still tease out why something's important. And oftentimes they're focused on something you're not focused on. And if you have that relationship that you can, sit down with the seller, maybe get the lawyers off the phone and say, hey, you're really keyed in on this provision. Like, help me understand like what you're trying to solve for. And they go down this rabbit hole of, well, I'm trying to solve for X, Y, and Z. And you're like, oh, well,
Can you put a
I
different
don't
provision in
care
that
about that
covers
at all.
that? That's like, yeah.
And so a lot of times you can bridge that gap just by using that relationship. And it's not even at that point, it's not even a put and take. It's like we're asking for two different things. Like this is an easy give. We just need to get the words right on the paper. So yeah, it's important to be flexible. It's important to know what's really important to you, what's not super important, so you know where you can balance that give and take as you go throughout the process. So
Yeah. And it's a really, I think, overarching interesting point around the transactions are different because they're so heavily personal on both sides.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you've got we talk a lot about how personal these transactions are to the seller, right? This is their baby.
yep,
This is their one shot at a wealthy retirement. This is their opportunity to pass wealth on to their next generation. We hear that all the time. It's really personal for the buyer as well. The buyer has been searching for a long time. The buyer is more likely than not going to be the operator for this business. It has deep personal significance for their wallet, but also what they're going to be doing on a day in and day out basis. And it's
yep,
just, I think that because of that, it allows for some wiggle room in terms of, hey, what is important to me? What is not important to me? How can I negotiate? Because both parties are coming to it from this like very closely held position. Super interesting.
yeah. No, 100%. We talk about that all the time. Even on like the deal process, right? Like a classic example we'll use is like if you're a buyer and your background is in like financial analysis and accounting and things like that, like
Yeah.
do not do your own quality of earnings, right? Like we tell people this all the time. They're like, "No, we're just going to do it myself." And it's like sellers underestimate all the time how emotional or buyers, sorry, underestimate all the time how emotionally invested they become in these businesses. And even if it's like your bread and butter, like this is what I do for a living, where like you need that like outside third voice to try and help ground you when the kind of emotion of the getting the deal done, right? The emotion of like, oh my gosh, I'm about to leverage my entire financial future with a personal
Yeah.
guarantee, right? As that starts to weigh on you, you need that objectivity to help keep you grounded. And it's super important to remember it's just as emotional, if not more so, for the seller, because you're absolutely right. A lot of times it's emotion talking. We'll do we'll do deals where the seller is just, I mean, they negotiate nothing in the purchase agreement except what's the benefits package for employees post closing, which from a financial perspective is insane, right? It's like the last thing you should be worried about, but you have the seller that thinks of this employee base that's worked for them for 20 years as family, and they're like, yeah, I'm getting a few $1,000,000 bucks. I'm going to have a great nest egg. My retirement's going to be wonderful. I really want to make sure that Mary Jones, who's worked for me for 24 years, is taken care of
Yeah.
by Josh after closing. And so that's like the sword I'm going to fall on. That is a 100% emotional kind of issue for the seller to want to take care of their people. And it's important to tease that stuff out and understand because if you're going to subsidize health insurance by $900 instead of $800, and that's what gets the deal done, while you're really worried more about the indemnity, like there's a
Sure.
lot
Great.
of give and take you can give there, right? Like an extra $100 on benefits subsidy for employees, like that's a no brainer if it gets you a high quality indemnity package, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean about really understanding kind of the emotion, what the counterparty's really after. This is just as much for sellers as it is buyers. A seller should be doing the same thing and understanding what's driving the buyer, what are they really worried about, what am I really worried about, and how can we bridge that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you and your partners have grown SMB Law Group pretty rapidly over the last couple of years. What's been the biggest surprise during that process? And have there been any lessons learned for you in terms of, what does it take to build a business like this from scratch versus, particularly as you exist in an industry around buying small businesses?
Yeah, we believe me, the irony is not lost on us that we're a startup law firm servicing folks who buy and sell businesses. It's a great question. I mean, I couldn't even begin to summarize the lessons learned. I think my biggest takeaway, and certainly from a learning perspective for those listening, is don't underestimate how much hard work goes into running a business. And I don't say that as if we went in with some like rosy colored eyeglasses on, that like this was just going to be a layup. We were going to, put up a website and everything was going to be easy. We knew it would be hard work, but we had no idea how much hard work it would be. Particularly if you're in startup mode, because we are just, 18 months into this, we are just maturing to the point where we can move business functions out to business experts. For the last 18 months, not only has our full-time job been delivering legal service, but we've also been HR and marketing and finance and accounting and book, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, to a certain extent, like the ETA community has it spot on that stepping into an established business can be infinitely better than starting up a business, because oftentimes you're stepping into a lot of those functions being well developed. But that said, I mean, it is absolutely drinking from a fire hose. And I joke, I was on the phone with my brother and sister-in-law. I was asking some advice from my brother because he launched a professional services firm 7 or 8 years ago, with a handful of partners, and just picking his brain back when we were launching. And my wife was listening in, and mentioned, my brother and sister-in-law asked, my wife, how are you feeling about this? Are you excited? He's leaving his corporate job, doing this entrepreneurial thing. And her response was like, yeah, we're super excited. He's going to be, we're going to be able to have him around more. He's always worked such long hours in Big Law. And I'm not kidding you. My sister-in-law, who was sitting in the passenger seat, they were in the car driving to go out to dinner, just busts up laughing, right? Just laughing hysterically. And she goes, "Oh, Tara, talk to me in 6 months." Right. And we're like looking at each other like, oh, haha. But it's funny
Yeah.
post hoc now to realize like what she was laughing about was like, yeah, every entrepreneur's dream is the ultimate flexibility. And I work 2 hours a day, and I never thought I would be working 2 hours a day, but it's just an immense amount of work that I think you and your family needs to be prepared for those who are who have a family, right? I mean, this is not a solo endeavor. This is just as hard on your spouse and your children and your personal relationships and friendships as it is on you as the entrepreneur going for it. And it's super important to kind of be aware of that. So that would be first lesson learned, and first kind of word of advice is like, prepare your personal circle that like they're not going to see you for a while. Like you got to put all your attention in, and it's going to be all hands on deck. Much more than 9 to 5 than you think it is. Biggest surprise, I wouldn't say that's the biggest surprise. I would say the biggest surprise to me, and this is about our journey specifically, has just been the overwhelming support from the ETA community, which is a largely virtual community, right? Legal services has historically been such a people business, that there's still this pervading idea in the legal community that like, you got to have the downtown office with the mahogany desk where a client can come sit down across the table from you. And like the whole idea of like across the table from you is just,
Yeah.
now where I sit, that's just so foreign, right? Like I
Yeah.
meet and see my clients in coffee shops and over a beer, and, 9 times out of 10 over Zoom. We've done hundreds of millions of dollars of transaction, uh, you know, business transactions, enterprise value with people we've never met in person, right? And I think that's been kind of one of the most surprising things, is just how much this has taken off, how much what we've been building has resonated with the business buying community, in a largely virtual format, and kind of the interesting friendships and opportunities and things that's opened, where now I live in a world where, pick a random place on a map. If I have to travel there, I can send out a tweet and probably have 3 people wanting to grab dinner or have a beer in,
Yeah.
Watonka, Minnesota. Like, I don't even know if that's a real place. I made it up, right? But like, you get the point. It's
Yeah.
just such a vibrant community. It's certainly been the most surprising thing to me, and hands down the funnest thing to me. We launched this firm because we love entrepreneurship, not because we thought this would be the most lucrative thing in the world. We actually didn't think it would be the most lucrative. We thought we'd get a few clients here and there, 5 or 10 transactions at a time, and whatever. Now we are 18 months in. We're over 10 lawyers, right? The rocket ship keeps climbing, and it's just been surprising, to us, I think, at how resonant kind of what we've been doing and how we've been addressing the kind of unmet need in this market has gone. So, yeah, I mean, that's my thought.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a fun entrepreneurial story in addition to an SMB story. So
100%.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm actually, because we've been going for 40 minutes, I am going to open it up for
Let's do it.
questions in the chat. So please put your questions to Kevin in the chat. I have a couple more questions that I've prepped here that I can continue to
Is it
ask.
is this where we
But
find out that nobody but my mom and wife joined? Is that what we're gonna see?
we've had pretty decent numbers on this one so
I'm
far.
kidding.
Actually, I've been happy with it. So just because there's a decent number of people doesn't mean that they're chatty. So
Fair enough.
please put wherever you're streaming this from, please put the questions in the chat. And my next question for you, Kevin, as we wait to see if anyone has any burning questions, or if you've just satisfied everyone's curiosity completely with your first answers here. Just any particular stories from deals, or your legal work that you think our audience of primarily SMB buyers would find interesting.
Yeah, I mean, specific stories are tough just only because of, confidentiality for
Confidentiality,
clients
yeah.
without running it by them first. But what I will say, um, one of the funnest things about this space that I've already alluded to is the people, right? Who our clientele is and who we get to know, people that we would never otherwise ordinarily have met. And one of the things I've learned from watching such a diverse group of people, right? You've got Stanford GSB grads, you've got blue collar workers, you've got veterans, former military that use the GI Bill to go to state school, that are buying a bit, right? Just such a diverse place. Everyone that is successful at this just has such a tenacity about going out and searching and finding businesses. And the stories that I love are not I found this business on Biz Buy Sell and I put in an offer and it was taken. Such fascinating stories of how people
Yeah.
are finding businesses, right? I did a trek to Kilimanjaro last fall with a group of entrepreneurs where we were all telling kind of our
With
origin
with
stories. And
Clint's group.
yeah, with Clint's
Awesome.
group.
Yeah.
And so one of the guys on that trip was telling us that he was doing a proprietary search, right? And I told the story to so many people, and I love it more every time I tell it. If you're listening, kudos, you know who you are. Was doing a proprietary search, which means rather than going out to listed businesses, he's just going directly to private businesses to try and see if they would be willing to entertain an offer to sell. He was very focused on the type of business and the geography where he was searching, running into an absolute brick wall, right? Random business guy reaching out to other business guy wanting to talk about buying their business. Like, they field these calls, with some reasonable frequency. They're lowball offers that are offensive. Like, we want to give you $50,000 cash down and 98.9% seller financing, right? Like, it's just a waste
Right.
of everyone's time.
Yeah.
Running into an absolute brick wall. And one day he had a high school kid that was 17 years old come to him that just said, like, my ambition in life is to be an entrepreneur. I want to learn everything I can. I'll do whatever I can to help you. If we could work out some sort of internship arrangement, like, I would love to, like, be mentored by you and what you're doing and things like that. And he all of a sudden had this idea. He's like, what if this cold outreach was, instead of a business guy reaching out to business guy wanting to buy his business, what if it's high school student reaching out to business guy wanting to learn about entrepreneurship and owning and running a business? And so he gave this high school student a script of all of the qualifying things that he wants, the type of business, the size, the et cetera, and set this high schooler loose doing cold outreach to the types of qualified businesses and like, what business owner, what entrepreneur, if you're listening, would turn down a call from a 17-year-old high school kid that wants to pick your brain about business because his lifelong ambition is to be an entrepreneur, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, that leads to them having a conversation about business, teasing out from, the list of kind of qualifying things. If this business qualifies, how many employees, how hard is it to manage your employee base? Oh, you've got 40 employees. Check. And and then the end of the conversation is, I actually talked to this other business guy that like is in love with businesses like yours. He's actually a really serious investor in businesses. I actually think you guys would really benefit from a conversation. Do you mind if I pass your phone number along? Like, oh yeah, sure. Pass my phone number along. And that was literally how he found his first business to buy.
Oh man, that's amazing.
Such an incredible, like it's those types of stories. That's like anyone sitting there at 9 o'clock at night after their corporate job, surfing biz buy sell, trying to wade between the FedEx routes and like the diamond in the rough. It's that level of like out of the box thinking and tenacity that I absolutely love about this community and folks that are out there getting jobs done. And again, that's not to crap all over biz buy sell, and we represent clients that find their businesses there. That's not to say they're not good businesses. That's only to say, stories from the that the audience may find interesting. Think outside of the box, be crazy thinkers, be creative thinkers, push on why things are done this way. Just because it's been done that way doesn't mean it has to be. That's the story of our law firm. Lawyers billing by the hour for hundreds of years. And, we just decided we're going to take a different approach. We're not going to bill by the hour. We're going to do something else. And when we were launching our firm, everybody to a T loved our business model when we started talking about it early on. This is the greatest idea, except for one category of person. And I'll give you 3 guesses what that category of person was, right? Other lawyers. Like,
Right.
That's not going to work. You're going to lose money. Like, this is going to tank. That's a terrible idea, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of laugh about it now, 18 months later, that it's like, just have the tenacity to look at something and say, I get that I get that an industry's been doing this for 50 years this way, but does it really need to be? That you may surprise yourself. So anyway, one little anecdote there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We've done some work with students at Private Market Labs, and I always tell students that being a student is a superpower.
100%.
And if you can just reach out to people and say, hey, I'm a student, I'm studying this, and I would just love to learn from you. It opens a million doors, and that people need to be bold. And I think even for my first entrepreneurial venture, before I had all the grace, I would reach out to people, just say, hey, I'm a graduate of this policy. I even like pitch myself as like an ex-student, and that even helped get me open. So
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, I'm studying this, and that worked. So
yeah,
anyway,
I love that.
We have a couple of questions here, both from Yasmant. And so I'm going to put one of these up on the screen, and I'll sort of throw both of them at you. So first of all is, how earlier should a searcher engage SMB law group, for legal services? And, how do you manage sort of what you use legal services on? So the question was about, should LOIs be vetted by a lawyer, or should a lawyer come in, later in the process? So yeah. I think both of those questions are really relevant to our population. So,
yeah, I think so. And both really great questions. And that's, whether it's SMB law or not, I mean, this is just kind of general advice. It's not even unique to us. The easy answer, like, look, is as early as possible. Like, come to us when you're thinking about doing an LOI, and, we can help, blah, blah, blah. All the salesy stuff that people normally send to you. The real answer is you want to align incentives, right? One of the reasons why our structure is different is because we don't want searchers spending a lot of money early on in the deal when there's a much higher risk of the deal falling apart. We want that money being spent on legal services late in the deal or at closing when you actually have a business to show for it. And so part of what you need to be doing is understanding kind of what your resources are and how they're being spent. The last thing you want to do is engage on an LOI with a lawyer when, like, maybe you need some help, maybe you don't need some help on that LOI, but it turns into a 10-hour engagement because the seller wants to negotiate a bunch of LOI points. And now you're already out $5,000, $7,000, $9,000 of your war chest to get a deal done just to get an LOI signed, right? And heaven forbid that LOI doesn't sign. Now you're $5,000, $7,000, $9,000 out of pocket. You've got nothing. So The direct answer is engage as early as possible, but try and align incentives, right? We do very low cost fixed fee LOI engagements for this reason. Like, we can't work for free. We have to make something to like pay our people and overhead. But by the same token, we want the LOI phase to be very inexpensive. And what we're focused on is trying to get your deal closed. If you're a sophisticated, you come from the private equity world and things like that, sometimes they're tempted to kind of run the LOI process on their own. The one thing I actually caution there too, which is why I'm serious when I do say as early as possible, just make sure incentives are aligned properly, is in the small business world, we see like sophisticated private equity people leaving way too much on the table because they come with a private equity mindset. Right. A lot of the deals in this space, for example, you're going to get better than market terms on indemnification because a lot of times sellers counsel don't understand what market is. 5-year survival seems reasonable, even if the market is, 12 to 24 months, just to like make up a random thing. And so you have a private equity searcher come in and they're like, oh, I don't need to spend $1,000 on an LOI or $2,500 on an LOI because I've done this 50 times with my private equity fund. And they ship off an LOI that has 12 months survival and a deductible that's market and things like that. When, if they worked with someone that really knew the small business space, we would have been able to advise them like, hey, you're probably better off holding back on some of this stuff because we can probably through the purchase agreement negotiate a better like deductible and survival package. It's not a guarantee, but it's possible. So I really do mean kind of as early as possible at the LOI phase at if you have the resources to do it. But we also understand not everyone has the resources or risk appetite to spend money on an LOI when they don't even know if they're going to get the LOI signed. So we'll still engage with you at any point throughout the process. The only other part I'll say there, just to tie that out then, is once you're under LOI, we actually like searchers, again, before they start spending even more money on legal, to spend the initial few weeks doing a deep dive on confirmatory diligence from a business and finance perspective. And this gets back to our earlier discussion, Josh, where I mentioned that, usually financial things that come up in financial diligence, those are deal killers. Legal diligence items are not. You want to try and smoke out those financial things early on before you start paying your lawyer real money. If you get $10,000 into a legal bill only to find out that financials were misstated in the sim, that sucks. You're out $10,000 of your war chest to move on to the next deal. So the timing piece there, it's a little bit of a delay. It's like, yeah, we highly encourage you to have legal representation on an LOI. But then we also highly encourage, not fully engaging and kicking off that legal process with kind of full service legal until you get through that initial stage of business and financial diligence to make sure that your original offer in the LOI is going to hold up and that reduces the risk of your deal falling apart. So that's kind of a nuanced multi-part answer, but it's the way that we recommend searchers be thoughtful about consuming legal services in this space, because you're not a private equity fund and a $20,000 legal bill for a deal that doesn't close is not rounding error to you. That can be literally the difference between now I got to go back to work a corporate job for a year to resave money to be able to have enough, funds to do a self-funded search. So it's really important to be thoughtful and work with people who are thoughtful with you. Again, not to be totally self-serving, there are a lot of high quality lawyers that will or can be encouraged to do the same approach. So it's just important, whoever you're interviewing or talking to work that through.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Thank you for the detailed breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last chance to ask Kevin a question. We're coming up on the hour, so let's end it with this one. If there's no more audience questions,
yeah.
Quickly, what are you looking forward to in 2024 when it comes to the acquisition space, and what do you see coming down the pipe for the search world?
Yeah. We've seen over the last 5 years kind of a new breath of life and sophistication into this ETA space. And I think as we get further and further out of the pandemic, where in-person things were difficult and people were still, kind of, learning that transition from, what things could look like to kind of work for yourself or work remotely or, work in your home community and things like that. We're seeing unprecedented demand, at least from our perspective. I can't necessarily talk about the market broadly, but from where we sit, demand continues to grow and be unprecedented to buy these small businesses. And we talk all the time about the, whatever you want to call it, the silver tsunami, right? This wave of retiring baby boomers and where that small business wealth has to go. Like that's a real thing. And we see it every day as more and more people are looking at buying businesses. What I expect to see in 2024 and what I'm candidly super excited for is this kind of increasing participation and proliferation of a whole sort of marketplace and ecosystem servicing ETA. ETA used to be kind of the tack on byproduct to all of these other things, right? If you needed legal services, you're going to a big M&A shop that may do your ETA deal, right? If you need financial diligence, you're going to a private equity quality of earnings shop that, you know, may service your ETA deal. Now we're seeing law firms, we're seeing quality of earnings firms, we're seeing insurance brokerages, we're seeing go down the list, quality of earnings providers that are focused and dedicated to the ETA space as this market continues to grow and mature. And I'm super excited. Tons of people, tons of friends of ours working on really exciting products, really exciting services to support the ecosystem, or not even to support the ecosystem, but where the ideation came out of like being part of this business buying process and kind of learning how important, overseas talent can be. So that's leading to a spin-off virtual assistant placement agency that may not be ETA focused, but it's grown out of this ecosystem of seeing how important kind of high quality overseas labor can be for small business entrepreneurs and things like that. So I would say for me, that's what I'm most excited for in this space, is to watch, a lot of these things start to come online and start to mature and watch the success of candidly close friends really starting to do exciting things in the business space. And I mean, your business, Josh, is just one of many that's the same story that's kind of building and maturing in this ecosystem, whether it's you, whether it's us, whether it's all these other services. It's a really exciting time for ETA, I think.
Yeah, couldn't say it better myself. That's awesome. I want to wrap it up with one more question from the audience, just because I think it's a really good question. And if we go over my self-imposed rule of an hour-long podcast, I'm gonna have to get over myself. Because
I'll try and answer this one in 3 minutes.
Don't worry about it. The details are helpful, and no one actually cares. This is a me problem. A large business brokerage once mentioned that they can't use custom LOIs. It has to be in their format. Just tell them what items you want to add. Is that normal? So I have an opinion on this, but I really am curious about your opinion as well.
This is where I'm going to bite my tongue, or we're going to turn this into a 2-hour podcast with a really, really long rant. Is that normal? That is normal for large brokerages who are trying to commoditize the market. It is not normal for M&A. So there are some very large brokerages. There are some very large brokerage, what do you call them? Industry groups in certain states that kind of develop their own forms that are really trying to turn the business of buying businesses into the real estate business, right? Mm-hmm. It's a fill in the blank template agreement. They don't use LOIs. Your offer is on a purchase agreement where you fill in the blank, you sign, you have a signed purchase agreement, you pay a deposit that goes hard after 14 days of due diligence, right? Like none of this stuff rationally makes sense for an M&A deal, right? Buying a business with a massive information asymmetry between the seller and buyer is just fundamentally different than buying a house where you can hire an inspector that's going to spend 4 hours going through a house tooth and nail and your diligence is done, right? That is not the case when you're buying a business. And we see this all the time. I just had a call very recently with a searcher that's several months into his deal, getting very close to closing, that only recently learned that one of the key employees is a family member, but through relationship, so that they never caught it because the names don't match up, is a family member to one of the sellers, right? That introduces massive risk to the business, because if the seller goes and does something else after the closing, this family member could leave and they're an integral part of the team, right? Like that's just the type of thing that comes out of diligence, that you need the time and freedom to poke under the hood. You need the ability to customize, to put in new reps and warranties when you learn certain things, to have a high quality indemnification provision to make sure you're well protected. It will shock no one to know that broker template form APAs are garbage for buyers. They're very protective for sellers, and even more protected for brokers who aren't even a party to the actual transaction. Um, so that's my long rant of no, this is not normal. No, it shouldn't be normal. I hate it. I hit my head against the wall every time I see it. All of that said, let's circle back to that earlier conversation of you have to set your priorities and understand your gives and takes. Okay. I don't want to call any of these brokerages out by name, but like pick your large random brokerage that just is absolutely not going to do a deal if it's not on their form template APA. You may love that deal, and that deal may be a very good deal, at which point it is a risk analysis for you to kind of sit down and break down what's really important to me. What am I able to protect using this crazy template APA thing through like addendums and edits and things? Can I get some more flexibility on this wonky deposit thing where they want the deposit to go hard after 14 days, which is just, absolutely asinine. You can still get deals done, and we still represent buyers and get deals done in these formats. I don't like it. I don't think it protects buyers very well. I can get very uncomfortable with the level of protections of buyers, but my job isn't to kill your deal because I don't like the level of risk. My job as an advisor is to advise you on what that level of risk is and let you make a risk assessment. And there are very, very few situations where the risk is so bad and we think the client is so far off that we're like putting our foot down, like we couldn't even represent you in good conscience here. That's usually not the level of crazy we're talking about. We're just talking about on a spectrum of risk, you're going to be further out to the seller favorable side than in the middle or the buyer favorable side. And that's an appropriate risk assessment for you to make. So that is a very long answer of no, it's not normal. Yes, I hate it. Yes, it drives me crazy. That doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do the deal. You just need to go eyes wide open, and understand and unpack what the risk to you is, and just be smart about entering into that transaction. Because I've seen clients close on great transactions on broker forms that I hate the form, but it's a good business and it's doing well post closing, and like good for them, right? We protect as best we can, and that's all you can hope for in these deals. So
yeah. And you hit the nail on the head in terms of what I was going to say.
I suspected when you said you had your opinions, I suspected I knew what they were.
My only addition would be the challenge that these forms put buyers in, and I think that it speaks to why these are challenging to navigate around and unfortunate, and is because most brokers will have a lot of inquiries on their best deals.
Yeah.
And so you end up in a situation where, as a buyer, part of your risk calculus is I could not fill this out, but I might also not end up with the deal, because you're more likely than not going to have another buyer looking at that same deal who is willing to sign that form. So I think, like, if you're like, look, I'm not going to participate in your process. Kevin talked at the beginning of the podcast about, running a good process, running a process that moves things along. If you're saying, hey, I'm going to push back on the process early, the chances of you being the person at the end of the day might be lower, because the broker might be able to find someone who wants to run their process.
Yeah.
So that's not to say don't do it, to Kevin's point, but it is, just an unfortunate reality of the way that this works right now.
It is. For everything I said to buyers about running a process and things like that, the same applies to sellers. So you have to appreciate that the broker is looking at this the same way. And whether you love or hate their process, the more uncertainty you inject into their process, the more uncertainty you inject into getting their deal closed. And so if it's a high volume national brokerage with a good deal that knows they're going to have 15 solid offers that they can chase, and you're the one that's like, I don't want to use your paper, I want to do this, I want to stage it out this, and they've got 14 others that are like, I don't like this, but like, fine, I'll put the paper in, like, you're not getting that deal.
Right.
And that's a conversation I have with those clients of like, look, set your priorities. And that's what I mean by the risk assessment. Because your risk assessment, maybe that's too much risk for me. Like, cool. Then don't waste everyone's time and like go on and search for the next business. So yeah, it's super important to focus on that and know what your needs and requirements are. And yeah, it's a tough one, because sometimes we see really good businesses and it's like, it'd be nice to have a smoother, more traditional process, but sometimes that's the name of the game.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, Kevin, this has been fantastic. I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you so much for being part of the pod. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for staying over the hour to answer questions. You can find Private Market Insights. Obviously, we were streaming live here. It'll be up still on X and I believe on LinkedIn for a little while. You can also find the video on YouTube. You can subscribe and find the audio version of this anywhere where you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. So please subscribe. We've got a number of great conversations in the archive, a number of great conversations already scheduled and coming up in the next month and a half or so. So thank you again, Kevin, and I'm gonna close the stream.
Thanks, Josh. It was great.